endlessly searching for an original sin.
Fortunately, he already knew what train to take and where to get off. From there, he asked a nearby police officer for directions to the hospital. It was only a 5-minute walk away, and Yuji had no trouble finding his way there. Unsurprisingly, for a general hospital, the building itself was quite large, with a pale of white walls and a seemingly endless parking lot. As Yuji passed through the automatic doors, he was greeted by a familiar hospital smell. He was cut through the crowd lobby and receptionist counter, where he was requesting permission to visit Erica. I keep doing that. After filling out the visitation paperwork, Yuji boarded the elevator, silently willing himself to calm down. Erica was in room 304. Sorry, one moment. I don't know why my throat's been like that. Arriving on the 3rd floor, he quickly checked the directory board mounted on the wall, then set off toward the beige and white corridor until he reached the room marked 304. The whiteboard on the door read Sarazawa Erica. Apparently, she had the room to herself. His heart began to thump wildly in his chest. Now that he stopped to think about it, it had been quite some time since they'd seen each other last. Was he going to explain this? Was it better to play it cool? He'd rushed over on a spur of the moment, but what was he going to say? He didn't think about that. He couldn't turn back now. Summoning all his resolve, Yuji quietly opened the door. Warmth of the room tickled his cheek. The interior was perfectly white, but a softer, almost fragile hue, nothing like the oppressive glare of the corridors. The curtains were rustling slightly with the breeze. She must have opened a window. He found her sitting on the bed. Her body was thin as a reed. Had she always been this small, or this pale? But there was no mistaking her smile.
姉さ
ん。よーくん。
The instant she called his name, he felt his eyes grow hot. A sob welled in the back of his throat, but he bit it back. She looked so happy to see him.
いきなりごめん。
びっくりしたけど、来てくれて嬉しいよ。学校は大丈夫なの？そう。
At this time of day, he should still be in class. Erica surely knew this, and yet she hadn't asked. Perhaps she guessed the reason for his sudden visit. Yuji shut the door behind him and then walked over to the bed. His gaze sank to the floor. Somehow he couldn't bring himself to look her in the eyes.
元気だった？
姉さんは？
もちろん元気だよ。私も、赤ちゃんもね。
退院はまだ？
そうね。あともうちょっとかかるみたい。早く外に出たいんだけどな。
She shrugged and sighed.
不便だろう、いろいろ。
病院は慣れてるもの。だから全然平気。
Like him, Erica had been in and out of the hospital since childhood. He knew resignation was a natural response, but it still made him a little sad.
おめでとう。会ってちゃんと言いたくて。
Erica broke out into a broad smile.
ありがとう。
This was the most beautiful he had ever seen her. She seemed fulfilled, happy. She had brought a new life into the world, and now she radiated joy and strength.
姉さん、今、幸せ？
どうしたの急に。
なんとなく聞きたくて。
Erica smiled shyly and nodded.
幸せよ。
そうか。よかった。
Of course she was happy. Still, he wanted to hear her say it. Relief broke the tension he felt since walking in.
ようくん、そこ座って。
She gestured to the chair by the bed and Yuji sat.
ようくんの方は、学校はどう？友達のこととか話してくれたじゃない？
うん。そうだね。
So, sis, one tried to put a knife in me, and the other one's just trying to bang the crap out of me. That's how it's going.
うまくいってないの？
You could say that.
そっか。
She nodded and closed her eyes. Then suddenly her face fell. It was such a drastic change, Yuji felt a stab of alarm.
姉さん？
うん。ごめんね。
She shook her head dismissively. But the next moment she looked up at him with resolve in her eyes.
あのね、
She held his gaze as she spoke.
私、ようくん、
I didn't mean to skip that. This caught Yuji entirely off guard. What could she possibly need to apologize for?
謝らなきゃいけないこと？
そう。ずっと言おうと思ってて、でも言えなくて。今日メールをもらった時にね、もしようくんがここに来たら言おうって決めてたの。
Oh, this is gonna be good. There, she paused. A few minutes passed before she started to speak once more.
言おうと思ってたのは、お父さんとお母さんのこと。それと、ようくんのことも。
Mom and Dad? He blinked. Erica's fingers curled around the hem of her hospital gown.
もっと早く本当のこと言わなくちゃいけなかったのかもしれない。言うべきだった。
事故？
She could only be referring to one thing, the car crash that had claimed their parents' lives. So what did she mean by the truth? Sorry. Her eyelashes dropped once and then...
あの事故があった時、
It was a hot, muggy day, and the drone of the cicadas was especially grating. The school was out for summer break, and Yuji and his parents were headed out to their relative's vacation home. The plan was to stay 2 nights. Erica had gone to study camp with her classmates and couldn't make it. His aunt and uncle arrived to pick them up, and Yuji climbed into the back of their station wagon. As they drove, he gazed idly at the passing scenery. Somehow, he never got tired of watching the buildings and signs fly past. He rolled the window down and a pleasant breeze rushed in. Next, he tried to lean out for a better look, but his mother scolded him. The mood was light. Shame that Erica couldn't make it. They said, maybe next year. Then the car pitched sideways. The world flipped. Crash. The car screeched the screech of brakes. Gravity yanked him out of his seat. What was happening? He tried to hold on, but his body was thrown from the car. Pain erupted in his skull. He must have knocked it against something. His body felt like it was being crushed. Amid confusion and fear, Yuji sank into darkness. He awoke in an unfamiliar room. When he tried to sit up, pain shot through his body. He was covered from head to toe in bandages. There was a machine beeping rhythmically somewhere nearby. A clear plastic mask covered his mouth, amplifying the sound of his breathing. A bunch of grown-ups were running around in a frenzy. Nurses, maybe? Some other grown-ups were standing nearby looking worried. At the time, he didn't really understand what had happened. They told him he'd been in an accident. A truck driver had fallen asleep at the wheel and veered into the opposite lane. The wreck of the station wagon had been unsalvageable. His aunt and uncle had died instantly, and his parents, as had his parents. Only Yuji had miraculously survived. Apparently, it was all over the news. He couldn't recall much of what happened, but he remembered the feeling like there was a hole in his chest. Something inside him was missing. He didn't know what, but he had an idea. It was the part of him that knew how to laugh when he was happy, cry when he was sad, shout when he was angry. After the accident, such displays of emotion became few and far between. In truth, he didn't find it that strange. He simply accepted that the accident had made him this way. That's called shock.
あの事故があってから1週間後くらいかな。ヨウくんもだいぶ回復して起き上がれるくらいにはなってて。お見舞いに行くと、ヨウくんはいつも窓の外を見てた。何かを探すみたいに、ずっと、いつまでも、窓の外を。
A shadow fell over Erica's expression.
ごめんね。部活があったから今日はちょっと遅くなっちゃった。隣のおばちゃんから桃もらったよ。一緒に。
たら。
Is there any voicing for this?
なって。
Yeah.
お父さんが。
お父さん？お父さんが、どうしたの？
お父さんが、僕の上に乗ってきて、お母さんも乗ってきて、何かが刺さる音がして、お母さんがボキボキってなって。
Well, that doesn't sound like what happened at all.
ヨウくん。
お父さん、ぐちゃぐちゃになって。幼
児やめて
Erica breathed a shudder and sigh. As he listened, Yuji felt like part of his brain had gone numb. It felt like she was talking about someone else, someone he didn't know.
あの時、ヨウくんの肩を掴んで、揺さぶったんだけど。絶対に窓の外から目を離さなくて。ヨウくんがつぶやいてたことも、事故のショックのせいだと思ってたの。でも、
You know, I was joking earlier about the cult being the one that killed his parents.
あれは、ヨウくんが実際に体験したことだったんだよね。その後、お葬式でも。
何でもぶつかったトラックが積んでた鉄骨が窓から入ってきて3人の胸を貫通してたんだと。匠と泉さんが幼児を守るように覆いかぶさっていてな。
まあ。
だから幼児も即死だと周りは判断してたらしいんだがな。なぜか幼児だけが病院で息を吹き返したんだそうだ。
奇跡ね。助かってよかったじゃない。
いやだがな、少し気味が悪くないか。 鉄骨は確かに幼児の胸も貫通してたらしいんだ。それに匠だけなぜか損傷が激しくて人の形をとどめていなかったらしい。幼児は体がびっしょり濡れていて、何か血液のような体液が検出されたって話だし。
We call that blood-like fluid, everyone. Blood.
血液のようなって血じゃないの？
厳密には違うらしい。
あらまあ、それはそうね、ちょっと不気味ね。
親戚の人たちはみんな、陽くんが一度死んだのに生き返ったんだって、そんな風に言ってた。ひどいよね。どうしてみんな素直に喜んでくれないのかって。でもね、確かに陽くんは病院に運ばれた時点では死亡していると判断されていたの。
Erica struggled to hold. Yeah. Erica struggled to hold back
奇
tears.
跡的に息を吹き返したのよ。
She'll stop eventually. Yuji recalled a moment at the funeral when the teary-eyed Erica had hugged him tight. He'd never forgotten what she said to him back then. I'll keep you safe, I promise. At the time, he hadn't understood what she meant. But now, maybe he did. Just then, a wave of dizziness washed over him. All this time, he'd only ever heard that his parents had died in the crash. No one ever told him about the steel beam, piercing all three of them together. So that was how he'd gotten his scar. He clutched his chest. His scar was aching. You died and came back to life. You're not human. You make everyone suffer. He tightened his grip on his shirt. It hurt to breathe. He didn't know what he wanted to say. He just needed to say something before he went crazy. Erica looked at him, eyes wet with tears, and stretched out her arms.
陽くん、
Her soft, pale hands cupped his face, pulling him into a hug. As he pressed his forehead against her shoulder, he smelled something faintly familiar. Fuzzy memories of their mother revived in his mind.
ずっと黙っていてごめんね。怖かったの。本当のことを言ってしまったら、陽くんがまたあの時みたいに、窓の外を見ていた時みたいになってしまうんじゃないかって。陽くんは生きてるんだから言わなくてもいいことなんだって、ずっと目を背けてきた。でもやっぱりそれじゃいけないような気がしたの。本当のことを言わずに陽くんを守るなんて、そんな偉そうなこと言う資格はないってずっと思ってた。
Her embrace softened, and she looked at Yuji with a mournful eyes.
この間、陽くんが体調崩したって聞いたとき、不安だった。もちろん心配だったからなんだけど、それだけじゃなくて、すごく嫌な予感がした。なんだか、陽くんに何かが起こるような気がして、ものすごく怖くなって。でも、思い出したの。陽くんが生まれたばかりの頃、お父さんとお母さんに言われたこと。
父さんと母さんに
Erica's gaze firmly into his eyes.
幼児と私はたった二人きりの兄弟だから、もし何かあっても助け合って生きてほしいって。なんでそんなことを言うのかって聞いたら、お父さんとお母さんはこう言ったの。
She wrapped her arms around him once more. He could feel a soothing warmth radiating from her petite frame.
変わらないものなんて何もないって。何が起きたって不思議じゃないんだからって。たとえそれがどんなに大きな変化でも受け入れて、それでも前へ進んでいく強さを身につけなさいって。
強さを。
そう、強さよ。その時は意味がよくわからなかった。本当のことを言うと、今もまだわからない。でもね、こうやって抱きしめられた時、お父さんとお母さんのぬくもりが伝わってきたの。
She nuzzled her cheek against his head.
わかる？伝わる？私の温度が、ぬくもりが。
This man is in perpetual shock. Yuji slowly closed his eyes. Sure enough, he could feel her affection and her strength. Her warmth filled his body, enveloping his soul. Forgiveness, understanding, acceptance. He had a feeling that those three things were what it took to be truly strong. Erica gently pulled away, wiping her damp eyes. She straightened up and put a sweet smile on her face.
あのね、ちょっとついてきてほしいところがあるの。
She put both hands on the bed and slowly pushed herself up to her feet. Yuji quickly put an arm around her shoulder to support her as she looked frail and unsteady.
ありがとう。
She shot him a grateful smile, and then together they left the room.
こんな風に歩くの久しぶりだね。
Erica looked up at him, her eyes a bit red.
そうだね。
大きくなっちゃったね。
あ、
He could remember the time when he used to crane his neck to look up at her. They boarded the elevator and rode down to the second floor. There, they walked down another type of hospital hallway until they reached a large window looking into the next room.
見て。
Erica stopped and looked through the window. The room was decorated in a cutesy style, and Yuji could see rows of little beds with newborn babies wrapped up snugly inside. There were 12 beds altogether, each marked with its occupant's name and gender. 2 nurses wearing masks and scrub caps were inside, checking on each baby and adjusting the dials of their heat lamps as necessary.
ほら、そこ。前の列の一番左。
Hold on. The stupid neck thing keeps crackling. Hopefully you guys don't hear it. She pointed to the one of the babies.
よく眠ってる。
She spoke softly, her eyes on the sleeping infant. The look on her face radiated the same affection and strength he'd felt when she hugged him.
ゆうくん、おじちゃんが会いに来てくれたよ。
ユウって言うんだ。名前。
ううん、
She shook her head and turned to look at him.
ゆうじ。ゆうやのゆうに、それから、幼児のじ。
Yuya. That was his brother-in-law's name. As for you, wait.
俺
It just hit him.
そう。私ね。
Erica smiled to herself as she gazed upon her slumbering treasure.
体が持たないかもしれないから、もう次は産めないかもって言われたの。だから、大切な子供に、大切な人たちの名前をつけたんだ。
Emotion welled in his chest. He couldn't speak. The only sound that passed his lips was a soft exhalation.
ごめんね。びっくりした？うん。つけちゃダメって言ってもダメだからね。これだけは譲れないの。
She fixed him with a determined look. Just then, little Yuji twitched in his sleep. Perhaps he was dreaming.
ダメだなんて言わないよ。
His voice shook as he forced the words out. He was so happy. And yet, for some reason, he felt like crying.
それなら、よかった。
Erica's smile brightened with relief, and she looked back at her son.
子供ってね、何かを訴えたいときには、泣くか、じっと見つめてくるんだよ。
見つめてくる？
そう。喋りたくても喋れないでしょ？だから、じっと見つめてくるの。それでこっちもじっと見てるとね、何が言いたいのか、なんとなくわかるようになってくるの。それでもうまく読み取れなくて、泣かれちゃう時もあるんだけどね。私もお母さんになりたてだし、これからこの子と一緒に、いろんなことを学んでいくんだろうなって。
Her voice was full of confidence as she turned back to face Yuji.
ようくん、何かあったんだね。悪いこととかいいことって意味じゃなくて、ようくんにとって何か大きなこと。
どうして？
この間電話したじゃない？あの時に声の感じが変わったような気がしてたんだけど、会ってみてやっぱりって思った。声とか顔つきとか雰囲気が少し変わった気がする。だから本当のことを話さなきゃって気持ちが強まったのかも。
ああ。
He hadn't noticed it himself, but she was probably right. He had changed. He had been through so much these past few weeks. Looking back, it felt like a dream. He still didn't know much. Still didn't know what was happening to him, to his body, and the thought made him uneasy. But coming to see Erica and hearing the truth, it felt like things were starting to take a turn for the better. His parents had died protecting him. The steel beam had pierced his chest, and yet he was still alive. No doubt he was incredibly lucky to have survived. All this stuff about him coming back from the dead, that was hard to take at face value. It was madness. And yet, when Erica had spoken of his miraculous resurrection, she made it sound so real. Oh my God, are we Jesus? He was still skeptical, of course, but he couldn't bring himself to reject the possibility. Everything he'd witnessed recently, blood, the weird lumps, were they real? He couldn't decide. He didn't know what was happening to him, to his body. Perhaps he'd simply lost his mind. Maybe it was all in his head. Maybe it was just easier to believe that he was some kind of zombie risen from the grave. If so, then so be it. In the past, he'd always wondered if his life had meaning. What worth was there in someone like him? He hadn't needed to wonder anymore. Erica had named her son after him. That knowledge filled him with a powerful sense of peace. His shoulders felt light, as if a burden had been lifted. No matter what happened to him, his name would live on together with his sister. Now he could descend into madness with no regrets. Tetsuo's face flickered through his mind. The loneliness, isolation, and anxiety that came with not knowing your place in the world. Tetsuo carried those same scars. Now Yuji finally understood. He and Tetsuo weren't so different after all. Aww. Alright, that's where we're gonna leave it, everybody. So I hope you guys enjoyed the... no, I think it's two... No, wrong one. So I hope you guys did enjoy. This was just a short little stream. I expect to go longer, but I have to go take care of some family issues. So thank you all for dropping by. I'll be doing a long one for supporters on Sunday during the day. And I'll see you guys then. Have a fantastic day, everybody. Bye.